Rare is a word associated with romanticism. But I must warn you, what I have to show is pictures of rare diseases. These are butterfly children. The stumps you see for hands are cause of flaky skin growing over what were once hands. The best one could do for the afflicted was to provide comfort, and now even that has been ripped away by secondary US sanctions. Sanctions imposed on foreign non-US entities for dealing with Iran. Actually, how are Iran's pharmaceutical market and industry impacted by sanctions? International economic sanctions, that is, that have been reimposed unilaterally by the US alone. The US claims sanctions have no impact on food and drugs availability. But to test the truth of that statement, all you have to do is take a glance at children with leukemia, butterfly children, and so many others afflicted by rare diseases or in need of specialized drugs. Drugs they cannot access or afford the way the economy is going. After all, sanctions do help increase inflation and decrease people's purchasing power. I'm Leila Faromarzi and you're watching Iran Today. Iran produces 97% of the medicines its inhabitants consume. This does not defy my earlier claim, however. I was talking of specialized medicine and treatment often for severe conditions of small populations. Populations so small that it is not economical for every one country to produce their required medication. Besides, a third of the medications produced in Iran are actually dependent on imported materials and imported medicine. Mr. Hashemi Golpayegani is Executive Director of EB Home. EB stands for Epidermolysis bullosa.
The U.S. claims that food and medications are not subject to sanctions. As the father of an EB patient as well as 750 other EB patients, I can tell you that it is not so in practice. I am feeling the sanctions. I am feeling the sanctions, for example, in dressing here for EB patients. From May 2017 to May 2018, 15 of our patients died due to the non-availability of dressing.
Dr. Golpayegani has suffered from the condition firsthand. He has a daughter with EB, but has put his suffering into helping so many more. And that is an individual choice. It has nothing to do with his being a cleric. At the best of times, no one country alone can alleviate all its pharmaceutical and medical problems. It's just not economical. And now a pandemic has hit the world. So it's going to take all the countries of the world to cooperate to get rid of that problem. If all those decades ago developing countries created the non-aligned movement, now it's time for developed countries to create an aligned movement to get rid of the pandemic. I'm going to bring you face to face with the man who proposed this to me here at Tehran's Hemophilia Center. Referring to US claims of having not placed sanctions on food and drugs, do tell me of your own experience.
I've been thinking of this for months now. We have to trigger a global movement under the name of the Aligned Movement. In reaction to Trump-led US actions across the world, the UN Security Council is required to launch a global movement. The so-called advocates of human rights, including European nations, should now come and launch a movement. Last time, developing nations launched the non-aligned movement spearheaded by the Indians. It's now the Europeans' turn to take action. What do we mean by the aligned movement? We mean a movement to be aligned with international ideals and achievements. At the top of them stands the right to health, which is the most basic right of mankind.
Mr. Qavidel, chief of the Hemophilia Center, places a lot of importance on people action in speaking up for those suffering in silence from sanctions, and also in fighting a certain pandemic. Regarding the latter, Iran's state of affairs with the pandemic is not just to do with sanctions, he says. It also has to do with hurried action in domestic policy making.
At the forefront of the fight on the coronavirus are people. The strategic mistake was that everyone imagined health professionals would be on the front line. The health professionals lie on the front line in sacrificing, but in tackling crisis, this is people who are on the front line. People must contain the coronavirus. They're on the front line under guidance of health experts. The second in line are media in informing people on the health experts' guidance. The third are trustees who would lead people because mistrust poses a challenge in such cases. The fourth in line are hospitals.
Iran condemns the US for its unjustified sanctions, which would no doubt be deemed illegal if intention and outcome matter. But it also sees sanctions as a godsend to steer the country away from oil dependency and toward further independence from other countries. What sounds like a contradiction does have an explanation. That is more than can be said for the US's claim that food and drugs are exempt from sanctions.
Do you have any idea of how to both withstand US sanctions and alleviate Iran's pharmaceutical problems?
A country targeting food and medications with sanctions has committed a war crime. Such a country is definitely targeting people's lives. The US is trying to clear itself of such charges, claiming that food and medications are not subject to sanctions. Okay, they are not sanctioned, but how can transactions be done for purchasing drugs? We are talking about a country with daily dependence on such medications, with patients who have to use such medications every morning.
I'll demonstrate in a bit how sanctions do include food and drugs by example. The current US President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal on 8 May 2018. This meant economic nuclear-related UN sanctions that were lifted due to the deal were now reimposed on Iran as US sanctions. This was followed by a stream of withdrawals. One by one, foreign companies started withdrawing their deals to export medicine, medical equipment and raw materials to Iran.
There's more to be said, but after taking a look at what other media outlets have to say. For that, I give you Shaksa.
Hi, my name is Shahrazad Manateri, and we'll be reviewing the latest update on Iran's medicinal needs in the face of US sanctions. In an article by Tehran Times, we witness how Iranians tell stories of resistance against sanctions. As the United States ramps up economic sanctions on Iran, Iranians from all walks of life take to Twitter and other social media platforms to turn the spotlight on how the US sanctions have negatively affected countless patients in Iran whose access to medicines were hampered by these sanctions. The 4-year-old daughter of one of my former PhD students is dying of cancer, and there is a shortage of medicine. Because of the illegal US regime sanctions and economic warfare, her medicine has also become prohibitively expensive. May the US empire, along with its enablers, rot and burn, tweeted Sayed Mohammad Marandi, a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Katayun Lamizadeh, a journalist, tweeted, "My young first cousin passed away last week because of cancer. She needed special medications that doctors said weren't available. Had she taken it, she would have been next to her little daughter right now, not in a grave." Another Twitter user, who is a pharmacist, has enumerated many medicines that the US sanctions prevented them from entering Iran. USA sanctions on Iran are resulting in lack of the most basic medical supplies, such as Plavix 75, Talfast 120-180, Sertraline Hexal 50-100, Detrucitol 2, Deferalines 3.75, reusable insulin pens, Mestitone 60, etc., tweeted Mahjonia. Experts believe that these stories clearly show that the US sanctions are illegal under international humanitarian law. Al-Monitor reports Ayatollah Khamenei states Iran must look inward to address economy. Iran's leader Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei said the country would never retreat in the face of new sanctions. During a video speech delivered to a military university, Ayatollah Khamenei addressed the new US sanctions and the maximum pressure strategy, saying, "We will not ignore the role of the malicious Americans and their sanctions on the economy, which are certainly criminal." He added that Iran will make them regret their maximum pressure. In response to US President Donald Trump boasting about the damage US sanctions have done to Iran's economy, Ayatollah Khamenei said taking pride in such crimes can only come from such a scoundrel as yourself. He continued saying that sanctions would be an avenue to create real economic resistance. That's all for this segment. We'll see you next week.
On May the 18th, 2018, that's 10 days after the US pullout, Roquette, a French producer of starch for medical uses, said it had decided to cease all trade and sales with Iran. It noted, "This decision is as a result of the recent announcement by the United States of America, which, if ignored by us, is expected to adversely affect our US operations." In just about a month, in June 2018, the Italians and Germans came up with the same.
The first and basic expectation was the modification of sanctions on Iran at a time a pandemic is targeting not just a nation, but rather the entire mankind. The US even toughened the sanctions while the Europeans stood and just watched. France and Britain take pride in defending human rights. How could they remain silent vis-à-vis the sanctions imposed on a nation at a time of a pandemic? This pandemic requires international unity.
The Italian pharmaceutical company Recordati wrote, "We are very sorry to inform you that as a result of recent and severe restrictions on the operations with your country, we will be unable to continue the business of our products from the 1st of August 2018. And how the German branch of JRS Pharma put it was, "Due to political circumstances out of our control, our banks can no longer accept any payments linked to Iran businesses." Next, in August of the same year, Gentige, a Swedish manufacturer of hospital equipment, said, "Due to extended sanctions against the Republic of Iran, we have been informed by our compliance department that we are not allowed to engage in any kind of business with Iranian-based customers." The above were just a handful of examples dotted all over the globe by companies fearful of US retribution. They didn't mince their words, and the timeline speaks for itself. US sanctions, both direct and secondary, equal both an economic and medical war on Iran. Let's call it siege warfare. Interestingly, the US has admitted to its guilt by contradicting itself time and again. Here's what US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told CBS News on February the 14th, 2019. "Things are much worse for the Iranian people with the US sanctions, and we are convinced that will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime."
The US is reversing its position on its causes of honor. The US took pride in having rejected racism, but under Trump, racism was approved of. Trump has cut budget allocation to all international organizations, exerting pressure on them. The US pursues its bullying and unilateralism regardless of what is underway in Iran.
Can Pompeo himself have put it in plainer words? That, so what if Iranians with chronic eye injuries have to suffer from no access to their life-changing high-quality eye drops? So what if their eye injuries are from exposure to chemical weapons during the Iraq-Iran war? So what if we, the US and allies, turned a blind eye as Saddam's Iraq showered those civilians with chemical weapons, even provided him with those dirty bombs? How the sanctions indirectly impact food and drug imports and exports to and from Iran is, yes, the existence of banking and monetary sanctions. Because banks are wary of transferring sums related to dealings with Iran. But it's more than that. Not all medicines or medical devices qualify for the exemption. and medicines do become prohibited if they are found to be going to a designated actor or entity, according to Justine Walker, Director of Sanctions Policy at UK Finance, which represents British banks.
A blood fractionation center is to be set up in Tehran, but the equipment needed for this purpose could not be imported because of US sanctions. I want to say that even medical equipment are under sanctions.
Now, we said Iran was itself making 97% of its needed drugs, even manufacturing various drugs in new fields. I got to talk to a young pharmacist whose company has created a new antiseptic solution helpful with COVID-19. This can be of interest to you wherever in the world you may be, in a bit.
We've come a whopping long way to Safadasht, off Malad, off Karaj, off Tehran to see Kimia Farm Company. Here we'll be talking to quite a high-ranking politician with a medical background to see how the country is balancing sanctions with the pharmaceutical industry, how they're keeping the industry going. Kimia Farm makes tens of tons of pharmaceuticals for man, beast and land alike in high tonnage.
The said politician was Mr. Qazizadeh Hashemi, who visited the company to learn of its latest products to approve on a media occasion with an accompanying delegation.
The most important thing is our financial transactions. Even if we intend to purchase raw materials or medications from anywhere, or even if we intend to export any materials, we will face financial problems for either payment or receipt of money. Therefore, our medication system is under full US sanctions. It has become so difficult for us. Of course, we have reached a good level of self-reliance, and we are exporting drugs and medications too.
The pharmacist I told you of is this lady right here.
The hydrogen peroxide mouthwash produced by Kimia Farm Pharmaceutical Company is used for washing mouth and gargling before referring to dentist. This product has won the approval of US and European dental associations. In addition to its bactericidal effects, this antiseptic mouthwash neutralizes a variety of bacteria including Streptococcus type A and B. But most importantly, this mouthwash also reduces the viral load of the coronavirus in the throat.
The US has even designated to boycott Iranian food and drug-related companies. Which is why I asked if such essential industries ought not be distanced from the government and semi-private enterprises.
Many natural persons and private corporations have been sanctioned. They have to be privatized. I agree, but they would also be sanctioned later, so nothing will change.
As for whether sanctions have been more negative or positive in that they will veer Iran away from dependence in any of its forms, here's what the deputy parliamentary spokesman had to say.
The sanctions have resulted in self-sufficiency. That's very good for us. That prompted us to major know-how for the commodities which we could not produce. We have very cooperative scientists. However, medication and treatment is a humanitarian sector. It is also urgent. Production is time-consuming because any drugs has to be tested on animals and humans before being produced. See how the world is racing ahead with the efforts to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. Under such conditions, Iranian patients depending on drugs will face problems.
To give you a few facts and figures on Iran's pharma market, according to the latest 2019 Global Innovation Index report, GII report, in today's $4.5 billion drug market of Iran, domestic companies have a 70% share. The market value for medical equipment in Iran is also $2.5 billion, with 30% of the market owned by more than 100 domestic manufacturers. The 2019 GII report praised the implementation of the Health Transformation Plan in Iran for having decreased the share of costs from 37% of all costs to 10% in urban areas and 5% in rural regions. It also said Iran had achieved $60 million in annual exports, a significant portion of which has been exported to European countries. These products have brought about $1 billion in annual currency savings to the country. Be it domestic or imported, Mr. Golpayegani tells us of his EB patients' needs and in what volume the medication and sanitary necessities are needed.
ما 750 تا قریب به 800 نفر شناسایی
We have identified nearly 800 cases, but we must expect 1,200 cases per 150,000 persons, as international data shows. Our consumption of dressing materials depends on the injuries. UNICEF has reportedly allocated 5 tons of dressing to EB patients of Iran, and we think it would be enough for 1.5 years to 2 years only.
The biotechnology sector in Iran has succeeded in producing multiple drugs for the treatment of, say, MS, multiple sclerosis, cancers such as breast cancer, immune system disorders, infertility, bone and muscle disorders, and hemophilia. And this it has done at low cost with high availability. The future is bright for Iranian pharmaceutical exports, good in quality and low in cost. The region alone is a 400 million strong market.
Regarding the hemophilia patients, the first innovative action was the development of Factor 7. It may be interesting for you to know that the only company in the world to produce Factor 7 was a Danish firm called Novo Nordisk. It produced for the entire world. In Iran, with a population of 86 million, we have 12,000 hemophilia patients, a portion of whom need Factor 7. Therefore, a single company can serve the entire world. But in Iran, it has been developed, and Iran is currently a producer of Factor 7. International observers from WFH came and visited our firm.
Iran is ranked 12th in the world and first in West Asia in terms of biotechnology. And it has among the top 5 biotechnology producers in Asia. That's a 2020 update. So far, 27 biotechnology medicines and 12 vaccine and 90 pharmaceutical raw materials projects have been implemented, as have been 55 projects in agriculture and food security.
When the coronavirus emerged, we had some problems at the beginning. But thanks to Iran's scientists and manufacturing plants, we managed to fill our own needs quickly. I don't claim that the problems have been resolved completely, but this issue has been partly resolved. For instance, we have already produced the active ingredient for insulin, but we were running short of vials. That had caused some problems for diabetic patients, but the government did its best and resolved the problem.
I'll give you an example. Just 700 may need a drug. It would not be commercially attractive to produce such a drug. An international distribution system is in effect in the world. It's an indicator of development. I would not produce everything I need. Anyone thinking so will fail in the world. Any production will not be commercial. For a rare disease, only 2 firms would be enough to produce the necessary medications.
It's just a matter of time, but thus far it's been survival in spite of sanctions. Because even the European architects of the nuclear deal and Instex are under the shadow of US bullying, fearful of dealing with Iran, even to provide medical support to this country. The world market is still dollar-based, and although Instex, or the instrument in support of trade exchanges, was devised for Europe to deal with Iran by avoiding dollar exchanges, that is not yet a transparent and fully operational mechanism. Mr. Qavidel and counterparts had a message for Europe. Sorry, not enough.
The Europeans have just one answer. I'm sorry. What does it mean? The French president expresses regret that the US has imposed sanctions. We signed a petition to WFH to help remove inhumane sanctions on Iran. Our request was decorated with the following slogan: sorry, not enough. The Japanese and Austrian correspondents and others came to this clinic and interviewed the patients. They were crying after seeing the conditions of these sick children.
That's it for today. Thanks for watching from the whole team. Don't forget to watch at the same times next week and each week after, and to leave your comments and topic requests. Bye for now.